Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be turning this color study into one of the largest gouache paintings I've ever done. Now if you follow my social media at all, you'll know that I love oil painting. Most of my finished pieces are created using oil colors. But what you might not know is my initial color studies, the first drafts of my paintings, are done using gouache. Gouache is a material that's kind of like watercolor, with a lot of the properties of acrylic, and is great for knocking out those quick studies before the final draft. Now I love gouache for my color studies, and I've only on occasion used them for finished works, but I was wondering, what would it look like if I made a gouache painting on the size of some of my finished oil paintings? Is it even possible? Well, I wanted to give it a try. Before painting, I need to prepare a surface. And not having the supplies I needed to make a trip to the art store. There I found a 16x20 hardboard and some Arches watercolor paper. Back at home, I started to sand the hardboard, just scuffing it enough to give the glue something to hold on to. I put glue liberally around the surface, then used a brush to spread it out. Then I apply the paper. Using a clean brayer, I roll out any possible air bubbles. Then I stack heavy books on top to weigh it down. Next I used a graphite transfer to transfer my initial sketch onto the larger surface. It ended up coming out super light, so I had to darken up the lines after. First I started with the background, painting the blue sky. Right off the bat I could tell this project was going to be a challenge. The color was laying down neatly, but I had to work really quickly to get any sort of color transition, as gouache tends to dry really quickly. The clouds came next, and this is where I could definitely tell how hard this was going to be. I ended up having to use some dry brushing techniques as a substitute for blending when the paint would dry too fast. Unlike with acrylic, there is no medium that you can add to gouache to extend the drying time, so I was forced to try other techniques. Especially with scenes that involve landscapes, I tend to start with the background and move forward, starting with the sky and distant mountains before moving on to the foreground. With gouache in particular, I have to paint around certain objects like these trees, as there's only so many layers that gouache will accept. The idea for this painting came to me when I was learning about micronations recently. This tower, while not actually located on a hillside, is actually a micronation known as Sealand, which is situated in the North Sea off the coast of the UK. The fort was constructed during World War II along with a group of other offshore forts as anti-air defense. In 1967, the fort was occupied by Paddy Roy Bates, who declared its independence and deemed it to be a micronation known as the Principality of Sealand. At this point, I moved on to the grassy hillside. Working quickly, I was able to create variations in the grass color to give the hillside some much needed texture. Next is the foreground. In order to incorporate atmospheric perspective into this painting, I had to increase the tonal contrast as the foreground moves closer. Atmospheric perspective dictates that the further things are away, the less contrast there is. This means that the mountains should have less contrast, while the plants in the foreground should have more contrast, or separation between lights and darks. Working within the reserved areas, I block in the trees. While I work on this painting, I'm constantly looking at reference photos and consulting my color study to get things as accurate as possible. In these rocks, I'm doing a technique known as a variegated wash. If I wanted two colors to blend together, I usually use this type of wash. I do it by laying down the first color, usually the darker of the two. Then while the paint is still wet, I paint in a lighter color right next to it, allowing for the water and the paint to bleed together, creating a transition. This is a common technique among watercolor and gouache artists, and is one of the main blending techniques. As I've come to find out, this technique definitely favors smaller surface areas, as it's less likely for paint to dry before the next color is applied when working in a smaller space. This is why this part of the painting feels much easier than before. One of my favorite parts about doing these larger renditions is being able to add some extra detail that would have been too small to add to the color study. These dandelions are exactly the detail I was excited to add. Now it's time for the main attraction. I usually like to save the subject for last, as it's often the most interesting thing for me to paint. This scene features a blue heron in the heat of battle with a snake. While unusual prey for a heron, this sight is not all that uncommon. After coloring the snake, I switched to the heron, starting off with the wing texture. I've been looking at tons of references as this pose is particularly unique. I'll most likely show this in a later video and talk about my drafting process, but I actually 3D modeled this scene in Blender in order to get a better sense of the lighting. One thing that I learned about the heron recently is that rather than biting to attack their prey, they use their sharp beaks to stab at their prey. In this scene, I wanted to capture just that, both the heron and the snake looking like they're about to strike. With the last finishing touches out of the way, I signed the painting. Overall, this was a very ambitious project. I definitely liked working with gouache at such a large scale, but for future projects I probably won't be going as big. The final product definitely feels more grand, but I prefer working with gouache at a smaller size because it's much easier to blend and create color transitions when not having to work in such a large area. I really liked working on this project, and I hope you enjoyed watching it. I'm hoping to be around for future videos, and I hope to see you there too.